Hello everyone! The most extraordinary game I've seen recently was played at the World Championship for players over 50. It's a truly beautiful game with some magnificent moves to find, a very lively game. So I've set up the board from Black's perspective, because in fact there will be more moves to find for Black, and I'm going to have you try to find them. The player with the white pieces is a 51-year-old Georgian named Kekelidze, and the player with the black pieces is 63 years old and named Lima. Alright, let's take a look at this game. White starts with c4, the English opening, the wing pawn coming out to control the central d5 square. So Black responds in a classical way with the e5 push. Both players develop their four knights, knight to c3, knight to f6, knight to f3, knight to c6, and then the e3 push. Black plays bishop. Bishop to e7, a 3 to prepare the b4 push, expanding space on the queen side, but Black plays a 5 to counter this advance. White plays d4. And there it is. This is a critical moment. For the first time in the game, the pawn structure is about to change, and significantly so. Look, there's the capture on d4, recapture with the pawn, and the push to d5, which will result in the creation of an isolated pawn for white. What is an isolated pawn? An isolated pawn is a pawn that no longer has another pawn to protect it. It's a weakness. We can see that the knight is attacking, but the bishop could also come to attack. The bishop, c8, could come to pin the knight on f3, which would no longer be defending the d4 pawn. And then, if the knight on d5 moves, the queen would also attack the d4 pawn. So we can understand that the d4 pawn is a target. Not easy to win, but it's still a target. And controlling the blocking square in front of this isolated pawn is also a critical point. Because to attack an isolated pawn, you first have to make sure it's blocked, that it can't advance. And the fight for the blocking square of an isolated pawn is often very important in chess games. And that's exactly what's happening here. Look, bishop c4. White develops by attacking the knight on d5. Black defends with bishop e6 and queen b3. White triples the attacks on the knight on d5, then plays a4. So they play queen b5 to keep up the pressure on the knight on d5, which is blocking the isolated pawn. But now, Black can capture on c3. Earlier, they were worried about the capture on e6, but now that the queen is on b5, the knight attacks the queen on b5, so you have to recapture the knight. First and foremost, this allows Black to exchange the bishops and now to castle. White castles and Black plays queen d7. Let's take some time to try to understand this position. The imbalances here are related to the pawn structure, and Black has assets on the queen side, because White's pawn structure is more fragmented. We can spot an isolated pawn here, a backward pawn here. So how could Black take advantage of the fragmentation of White's pawn structure? Well, they could try to play moves like knight a5. And that's why the queen came to d7. Sure, it created some awkwardness, but the idea is also to ensure the protection of the pawn on a4. And after knight a5, the queen has to move. Maybe the knight can go to b3, but maybe we can even play b5 to ensure its protection, so that the knight can come to c4, doubling up the attacks on the pawn at a3. Because if Black wins the pawn on a3, they'll have a very dangerous passed pawn on a4. So that's Black's idea. Play knight a5, b5, and place the knight on c4 or sometimes on b3. So how will White find counterplay? They're going to have a hard time resisting on the queen side. But the d4 pawn, this central pawn, ensures control of the square e5. And that's where White will find counterplay, using this square e5 for the knight. And even a better ability for White to bring forces pieces to attack the Black king. We'll see it in a moment. For now, White has played bishop f4. Knight a5, as expected. We're not afraid of qc7 because we could exchange queens. Then play kdb3 to attack the rook, for example, rook a2, to avoid losing the a3 pawn. And then Black could put one of their rooks in c8, which would allow them to recover the c3 pawn, and ultimately have a very comfortable position in this finale. So, as we said, White will rather look for play on the king side. So there's no reason for them to go exchange queens, which is why they come to d3. The b5 pawn, the queen protects the pawn, and the pawn will ensure the knight's protection. Rook e1. And so, Black plays rook e8 to counter the white rook on the open file. But now White plays knight e5. That was their asset, this square e5 for the knight. The Black queen comes to d5 and White plays knight g4. And there the player with Black, the Grandmaster with Black, will find the first tactical move of the position. There were others that weren't played because both players had spotted the threats. But here, a tactical move is going to work. Which one? I invite you to pause the video to look for it. We had said that one of the most important pawns for white was the pawn on f3, because it's the one that blocks black's passed pawn. And so bishop takes a3. White can't afford to take, otherwise there would be rook takes rook to e1. And if white tries to exchange rooks before taking the bishop, it still won't work because of rook to e1. So as a result, white has lost an important pawn. But they're going to bet everything on the counterattack against the black king. With queen g3, the threat is serious. The queen lines up with the black king and threatens knight f6 to make the king-queen fork, since the pawn will be pinned because of the queen's direct line to the king. Black will play rook e6 to control the f6 square with the rook. If it's taken, of course, the queen will have to recapture. The best move for white would have been to play rook to e5. But instead, bishop to e5 was played. That's also very threatening. The bishop, the queen, and the knight are all in position to attack the black king. And at the same time, since the bishop moved to e5, it blocks the rook's direct line, which allows white to threaten the bishop. And you might say, well, what about black? They're going to move the bishop, they're going to retreat. Well, no, the grandmaster with the black pieces doesn't retreat. Both players have decided to play the game of their lives, or at least the game of their year. The player with the black pieces doesn't back down. He plays rook g6, he counterattacks. He lets his bishop be taken, but he's going to counterattack on the knight, which is under a pin. He's going to play first. Knight to c4, he brings his knight back into play, attacking, and the rook retreats. And we'll see that the knight also has its role to play. The push to h5. So why did the knight come to c4 as well? You might think that white plays knight to e3 to counterattack the black queen. But after knight to e3, the knight could take the other knight. And if the queen tries to move away from the rook's attack, that would allow mate on g2. That's why in this position white can't afford to play knight to e3. They play h3, then capture again. The black pawn structure is stabilized. The rook is well placed, the king is defended. It's well placed because it defends g7, of course, and it attacks g4. And it also plays a role on the 6th rank. But we need to support our evolution on the queen side with the passed pawns. So c5 was played. A very nice move. It threatens b4. And if it's captured, we recapture. And we'll have those two connected passed pawns advancing to make a new queen. So white captures. Rook to e6, attacking the bishop. We triple the attacks on the bishop retreats to d4, we exchange on e1 with check the recapture, and b4. Of course, white can't capture because the bishop would be taken, so white plays g5. Careful, because white has 4 pieces to fight with. They have the queen, the bishop, the rook, and the pawn. g5 can be considered as a piece, because when it comes to g6, it will shatter the defenses of black's castled position. Black plays b3, they have their 2 connected passed pawns, protected by the rook. And soon a new queen. g6 is played. And now what to do? With black in the game, and the grandmaster with the black pieces continued his adventure with the pawn. He played b2, because if we take on g6, the threat is not queen takes g6. There would be the defensive retreat of the queen to f7. The threat is queen c7, threatening mate with the bishop. And if the queen comes to f7, then everything resets. And this time white wins. So we understand that we can't take on g6. And if we push f6, then queen to h4, there will be mating threats. Queen h7, check, king to f8, queen h8 mate with the rook, trapping the king. That's why, for now, black ignores the g6 pawn and continues with b2. Queen to h4. Now black can no longer ignore the pawn. g6, the threat of queen to h7 will lead to mate, so it must be taken. And here, the player with white plays a magnificent move. Look at this move. Bishop takes g7. So what should black do? First, you have to understand that the black king cannot take the bishop. Because if you take, the rook comes into attack. If the king goes to g8, queen h7, and the mate will be quick. If the king goes to f8, queen f6, and the mate will be quick. So black might play queen f7, thinking they lose the queen and will make another one. But that doesn't work. There would be rook takes queen, check, king takes, queen takes, knight check, and the queen is able to go stop the pawn. So it's complicated, but the computer shows that she is able to stop it. For example, if the king comes to g7, queen d4 check. For example, king f7, and there you go, queen d7. Check, we attack the king, and especially afterwards, we're going to come to b7. The idea for white was to reach this b7 square to attack the rook and the pawn on b2. So, in this position, it's clear that king takes bishop. It's too dangerous for black. So what to do? The problem is, if you don't take the bishop, the queen, bishop, and rook will work together against the king. So the grandmaster with the black pieces, he had the idea to play b1 to distract the rook and then take the bishop. But in reality, he had a better move, much better than this push to b1. An extraordinary move, a move that will be shown in books. It's the kind of move you see in books. So what is this move? I invite you to pause the video and try to find it. So what did you come up with? I suspect it was very complicated and that you wouldn't think of this move. I wouldn't have thought of it either. It's truly magnificent, by the way, to see that in this kind of position, such a move could happen. The best move in this position is knight to e3. How beautiful it is, an attacking and defensive move. And the defensive uses of the knight are very rich, very subtle. So, first of all, it creates a threat. Queen takes g2, mate. And if white plays, queen to h8, king to f7, there's no follow-up. The rook is blocked by the knight, the black rook attacks the white queen, and there's still that threat of mate on g2. So it's not possible for white to come to h8 and give check. So of course white might be interested in capturing the knight. But capturing with the pawn would now allow the black king to take the bishop, without the rook being able to help the queen in the fight right away, because the pawn blocks the rook, so there wouldn't be a forced win. Check. Whereas in the other variation, we saw that it was the decisive move for white, the move that made white win. So the knight on e3, if white captures with the pawn, it's an obstruction sacrifice, to block the file, to block the column. If it's the rook that captures, then in that case, the knight sacrifice would have been a deflection sacrifice to divert the rook from controlling the b1 square, and you could play queen check. And after king to h2, for example, queen to b7, the bishop is still under attack. We control the 7th rank and threaten mate on g2. It's winning for black, so a magnificent move, knight e3. This attack-defense move, incredible. But as I told you, the player didn't see it. It's understandable. It's not easy to see. It's actually very hard to see. And so the pawn went to b1 to distract the rook and then take the bishop. And now white plays c6. They want to allow the rook to come to b7. But you'll say the queen takes. That's what happened in the game, unfortunately. They should have left the queen there. Because in response to the threat, queen to e7 check, you need to be able to come back to f7 to cover the table. So the best move is knight to d6. That allows the knight to come back, defend, and also control the square c8 to counter the advance of the pawn c. And the rook will always help the a-pawn to advance and promote to a new queen. But after c6, black captured. And so queen e7 check, king h6, and the arrival of the rook in b7. And it's the black king who is being hunted. Now there's a threat. Queen h4 mate. So black plays queen d5 so that on queen h4 they can come back to defend, but pawn f4. And that threatens queen h7 mate, since the pawn deprives the king of any escape. So the black king is forced to run for his life and flee as fast as he can. The computer indicates that rook d7 is the best move, but queen f6 was played to allow the rook to go to h7, and after king g4 to be able to continue with rook h4. So the king keeps running away. Queen takes g6 check, king f4, queen h6 check, king e4, queen h7 check. And here, black misses their last chance to defend their king. They should have played queen f5. And after rook e7, play knight e5. And that way, they managed to keep the king protected. But unfortunately, the king went to e3. And here, it's not so easy to find the winning moves. When you look at the analysis, of course, you think you should have played this, you should have played that. But during the game, it's not so obvious. In fact, for white here, there's only one winning move. Which one? I invite you to pause the video once again. You found it. This is not rook e7 check. This is not a queen. h6 check. This isn't chess. This is rook d7. We attack the queen to then ensure entry into d3. So black came to c5 to prepare a counter check on the white king as soon as the black king moves. But look at what happens. Queen to d3, check. He goes to f4 check to the white king, but the rook comes to d4, check to the black king. This sequence of check against check is incredible. The king moves to g5, and now, unfortunately for this king, he is too exposed to the attack from the queen and the rook. There is no more defense, no more shelter. Queen to g3, check. If we start moving to the f file, there will be queen to f3 check, which wins the rook. So the king moved to the h file. The white rook can't deliver mate because we mustn't forget it's pinned. That's why the white king moves, threatening. Rook to h4. And now we're going to be forced to sacrifice the queen for the rook. That's what happened to avoid the attack with rook h4. So pawn takes. And now black is putting everything on the passed pawn. A 3, queen c7. Unfortunately for black, this move queen c7 is very painful. It attacks the knight, but more importantly, it threatens. Queen c6, attacking the king and the rook so that the rook can no longer support the advance of the pawn and that the queen behind the pawn stops it. That's why the rook comes to a 5. Queen takes c4, pawn, a 2. We're just one square away from promotion, but unfortunately for the blacks, look, queen c1, check. The king moves, queen a1, we block. King f7, so black might think that the queen can't move, otherwise there will be a new queen. But the problem is that white has 2 pawns and the pawns can advance. d5, if we take d5, queen takes a2 with the pin. Rook a8, g4, rook a3, to try to prevent the white king from becoming active. But g5, king g6, d6. And you can't take the g5 pawn because of queen c1, the fork. So the rook comes to a7, king h3, rook a8, queen f6 check, king h7, queen f7 check, king h8, g6. And unfortunately for black, they can no longer make a queen. Otherwise, queen h7, checkmate. So they check on a3, but the king moves to g2 and they end up resigning, since there's nothing they can do against the mate that's coming. And the unfortunate thing in this position is that black still has their pawn on a2. g3, because if it's captured, it causes a complete blockade, and so that would result in draw. But because of the pawn, we can't do that. And what if white doesn't want to take the rook and moves to f2? With the king, you keep chasing the king, and you keep sticking to the king, waiting for the king to take the rook so that it results in draw. And if the king never wants to capture, the rook will fall, constantly harass the king. And that would result in a perpetual check. This defensive resource is called the crazy rook. Ici, si se va être pécrance. The problem in this position is that because of the pawn, this defensive resource doesn't work. And so this is really the only moment when black would have preferred not to have this pawn anymore. So what did you think of this game? Personally, I find it incredible. There's so much life, so many twists and turns. It's interesting to watch games from these players, from that generation, because they were trained without computers, relying only on understanding and human resources. So it's fascinating to see such battles. If you enjoyed it, you can give me a thumbs up, leave comments, share the video, and support the channel. And we'll see each other again soon for new adventures on the chessboard. Goodbye, everyone.